Welcome to Behind the Research, a podcast that will focus on the realities of stalking with first-hand accounts from victim survivors.
I am your host, Karen Fullerton-Chalmers, and this series will focus on my doctoral research. Together, we'll explore the representation of stalking within film and television, as well as interviews with research participants to hear more about their stories and how these helped shape my findings. Caution is advised, as some content may be sensitive to listeners. Pseudonyms have also been used to protect participant identities. On this episode of Behind the Research, we are joined by Emily, who has been stalked 5 times throughout her life, all in different scenarios and lasting different periods of time, but all with the same outcome, the stalker not being held accountable. Emily's first experience of stalking was as a young adult by her boyfriend, and she managed to escape the abusive relationship. Some years later, she was then stalked by a man who she briefly dated, but who claimed false victimisation when Emily reported the incidents. Sadly, Emily's stalking experiences don't stop there. She was then targeted by her boss at work, and years later, she was stalked by her landlady, who would go into her residence when she was out, move her belongings, including stealing her identification. She would sit at the bottom of the street in her car and monitor Emily, and when she finally decided to move out, her landlady tried to follow her to her new residence. In recent years, Emily has been stalked by her neighbour, who threatens her, intimidates her, and posts things through her letterbox. But through all of these ordeals, Emily has continued, showcasing that she is a true survivor. Emily, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your experiences with us.
You're welcome.
So Emily, the last time we spoke was for my research, and that was about a year ago now, which, as we just spoke about, as time flies. So when we spoke at the time, you were still being stalked by your neighbour. Has anything changed within the last 12 months?
Well, yes and no, because this current stalker goes through sort of phases where his stalking escalates, and then the police get involved, and then he tails off, and then he's quiet for a little while, and then he starts up again. And he has been reasonably quiet over the past sort of few months, though there has been some verbal abuse and staring and that sort of stuff. But he's got to the point where he realises that he comes after me. I just file police reports. The police turn up at his doorstep in front of all of his neighbours, which is embarrassing for him. And, so he's tended to back off because he's realised over the course of the past 3 years that I'm not going to fall victim and behave in the way he wants me to. So, and I am also in the process of putting together an application for a county court injunction against him. But it's time-consuming, and part of the problem is you can't really find sort of templates online to follow that have been successful. And it's also pretty difficult to find a solicitor who can assist you who's got a background in helping victims of stalking, and I have managed to find one, but she wanted well over £200 an hour. So it's basically down to sort of me to do all of the paperwork and everything.
Yeah, and that's something we often hear, is that a lot of the time it's down to the victim or the person that's having to deal with a stalker that are then the ones left having to collect evidence or like you say, try and learn a system. If you don't know the justice system, it can be extremely complicated. Never mind, on top of that, you're dealing with this type of behaviour against you. So it creates a whole other level of complexity for people.
Yeah, and also in terms of injunctions, there's several sorts of injunctions, there's restraining orders, but depending on who's stalking you, you've got to do the right one. Because if you do the wrong one, like for example, restraining orders are for ex-partners or current partners, whereas a stranger stalker, you need to do a county court injunction, or say your boss at work or your landlady or whatever, because you don't have an intimate relationship with them. So there's also all of that to try and figure out as well, because obviously if you fill in the wrong thing, you're not going to get it awarded, etc. So legally, it's a bit of a minefield to negotiate.
And I think that's something that we spoke about when I interviewed you for the research, is about what can justice systems do better to support victims. And that's one thing that you mentioned, and other people that I interviewed mentioned, is that the landscape of this type of thing is just really challenging, and trying to understand a lot of it. And like you say, what fits with an ex-partner might not fit with a stranger or a neighbour. So how do you deal with that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, the justice system could simplify itself quite considerably. I mean, we have a incredibly complex judicial system in this country because it's been sort of cobbled together over the centuries. Rather, so it's a lot more complex than, say, American, which is only sort of 200 or 300 years old. Ours goes back centuries, and there's all sorts of really bizarre things, and then laws that you can come across that may or may not help you. It is really difficult, and there's no one place you can go to find out, to type in how, what do I apply for if I'm being stalked and I need protection, for example. There's no way of finding that out. You have to go through various, try and find out from stalking helplines, or sort of somewhere like the Rights of Women or something like that, but they don't necessarily have the legal expertise to be able to advise you on what you need to do. So it's the barrier after barrier after barrier, basically.
And again, it's about trying to unpick that whole thing. If it's centuries old, then how do you unpick that? But one thing I was going to ask you was that we often hear the myth that women don't stalk women, or that stalking does not happen in the workplace or by someone other than an ex-partner. However, your experiences alone cast doubt on those myths. So how does it make you feel when you hear people trying to fit stalking into a particular mould?
Well, people like to try and label things because then they think that they've dealt with it, they can understand it. It's like a little tick box exercise. But all stalkers stalk their victims differently. There is no one-size-fits-all definition of what a stalker is and how they're going to behave. And yes, there are similarities in behaviours with different groups or types of stalkers, but trying to fit everybody into sort of simple tick box exercises is just causing it causes a lot of problems for people. It's, from the legal point of view, from the police point of view, from the victim's point of view, because people don't fit. I mean, you look across your group of friends, they don't all fit into neat categories. So it's ridiculous to expect stalkers to fit into specific categories, and that they're not going to behave outside of a very narrow definition. One thing I have found is that women often use different tactics to stalk their victims to male stalkers, possibly because women tend to have been conditioned from birth that violent behaviour is not so socially acceptable for women. So tactics tend to be more subtle and less in your face, whereas a man is more likely to, say, follow you and shout abuse at you. A woman is not going to do that because a lot of it's social conditioning. And then also women stalking women, sometimes obviously, yes, it could be romance related, but often it's not. And it's not necessarily a desired romance, as some male stalkers are. But I found that there tends to be other factors that provoke it. So motivations can be different between the genders when it comes to why they stalk their victims. But again, there are similarities. So again, it's not easy to label people as to why people do or do not do things. I mean, both of my female stalkers had a previous track record of harassment before they started stalking me. The ex-boss, for example, had harassed the person who held my position before me out of the job. She'd also sexually harassed another colleague who was gay, and she harassed him because he was gay. She also couldn't keep an admin assistant because she was so toxic to work for. All of the clients hated her because she was so difficult to deal with. So there's a track record of harassing people long before I turned up. I did talk to some colleagues about the stalking after I left the organisation, and they suggested that she decided to come after me because they thought I represented everything she wanted to be and wasn't, and so she set out to destroy me. Now, that's their theory. To me, it does hold some weight based on my experience, but it may or may not be, the answer as to why she was doing it. And even after I'd left the organisation, she still kept going because I was still in the same profession, so she was still able to track me down wherever I went. And it continued right up to the point where I decided this is getting, completely out of hand because my career is being destroyed. So I basically changed my name, moved, and completely changed my career, and she was no longer able to track me down. And so she stopped. The landlady had a slightly different modus operandi, so to speak. She'd also got a history of harassing and stalking her tenants in all of the properties, which I always found a bit weird because, harassing your tenants out of your rental property isn't a good way to, bolster your bank balance. But she seemed to have a penchant for trying to exert power over people she feels are under her thumb, and she got a kick out of messing with people. She did temporarily stop harassing me and stalking me when I retained a solicitor who went after her and threatened her with court proceedings, because then her behaviour would have become public knowledge and her friends and family would know what she'd been doing. As she'd got a very carefully cultivated public image, which she didn't want to jeopardise, she backed off. She did start up again when I gave a notice that I was leaving the tenancy. And when I gave her the month's notice, she took to starting to follow me everywhere, presumably to try to find out where I was going to be moving to. And then after I moved, she was still causing problems in that she moved into the flat that I'd vacated, and even though I'd notified all the utility suppliers that I'd moved, she didn't. She kept everything in my name and didn't pay any bills, so I ended up with debt collectors after me because she ran up huge amounts of, electricity bills, water bills, all of that sort of stuff. Plus, she was also still applying for credit in my name, and they're not paying that either. But I think she stopped because the debt collections have stopped, and presumably she's gone after somebody else because she's got other tenants now. Because she owns 3 properties, and I did discover from talking to people that at least one of the other properties, because I know somebody who lives next door, she'd also done exactly the same thing to the tenants there. So it's one of those sort of things that I always find it weird that, particularly with law enforcement, police, they really want the stalker to fit into a nice little box. And they don't. And I mean, because the 5 stalkers I've had all employed different tactics, behave in different ways. Yes, there's been some similarities in behaviour based on gender, but you could argue that for any type of criminal behaviour. There's also been some similarities in behaviour between the ways stalkers have behaved regardless of their gender. I mean, for example, there are a number of myths of female stalkers that I've come across, which is, 1, as you said earlier, women don't stalk. 2, people in positions of power don't stalk because they've got too much to lose. 3, stalking behaviour is only worth a police attention when the stalker tries to physically attack or kill you. Given that a lot of female stalkers don't turn violent and intend to employ other tactics to stalk you, I always found when somebody was telling me this that it was rather ridiculous. And apparently, according to the police, stealing your identity and running up in huge debts in your name is apparently not a crime and apparently not something stalkers do. Therefore, anybody who behaves like this is not a stalker, even if they're exhibiting a lot of other identified stalking behaviours. And the other thing is, that I kept getting told was, the woman you're alleging is stalking you is nice, polite and well-educated. People like that aren't stalkers. And so you end up sort of sitting there going, you're basically you keep running into things where people keep mouthing stereotypes at you as to what stalkers do and do not do. And they don't seem to be able to comprehend that stalkers are all individuals and they don't necessarily follow, it's not like there's a guidebook of this is how you stalk somebody and you've got to follow this, otherwise you're not a true stalker. So it is quite interesting how there are similarities and differences between all sorts of stalkers. Out of the 5 I've had, there have been similarities and there have been differences. But there's no one size fits all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to make as well, especially with the whole stalkers don't fit into a box, and that's what a lot of people or societal views can be, is that stalkers look a certain way, they act a certain way, they are a certain way. And I think that's why it's really vital to have victim survivors' voices such as yourself talking about what they've been through, to showcase that it's not one size fits all.
Like a domestic abuser, there is no one size fits all type of domestic abuser. Mm-hmm. You can get, sort of people from sort of, the working class to the aristocracy who could be a stalker or, a domestic abuser. It doesn't matter. It's more of a psychological thing rather than sort of, specific physical traits or specific educational traits or social traits or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's really important to that you've highlighted really well, is that there's gender, there could be some similarities, but motives are very different, behaviours can be very different, and that's often not recognised. So I suppose my sort of final question is, why did you want to take part in the podcast, and do you have any key messages that you want listeners to take away from our chat today?
Well, primarily, I suppose, one of the main things is talking about your experience as a victim of stalking can be very therapeutic. It's publicly acknowledging what's happened to you. Talking helps you process things, helps you get through things. Also, talking to other people who are experiencing something similar to what you have can also help you and them. Although what works for one person in dealing with a situation may not work for somebody else, but it gives them options to think about. And there are a number of things that I've learned from the several decades of being stalked that might be helpful to others who are experiencing or have experienced it. The first one is that it can take some time to realise what's happening to you is actually stalking. But once you realise what it is, then you can do your research into the law, into the legal tools you have to try and address the situation, educate yourself on what's happening, why it might be happening, and what your options are. There's a lot of information online. There's also a number of organisations out there that can help and provide assistance. And never be afraid to contact somebody to talk about what's happening. And don't be afraid, if people try to make you feel, particularly for women, that you're hysterical or over-emotional regarding a situation. Being stalked is scary and you can feel like you're losing your mind, but you're not. And that's what the stalker wants you to do. But opening up, getting help, talking to people can really help you deal with it and make you not feel alone. And that sort of thing. One of the other things is that no victim has caused the stalking. The stalker chose to stalk you, so you shouldn't blame yourself because you're not responsible for the choices of other people. And following on from that, you may never know why your stalker has chosen to stalk you, but don't let the why consume you. You can guess, you can speculate, but you've got to accept that the why question may never actually be answered. Even your stalker gets prosecuted, ends up in court, gets cross-examined. They may never actually tell you why they did whatever they did to you. The other thing is that it's really important to keep a diary of absolutely every incident, no matter how insignificant you may think it is. Record every single incident of stalking, if it's safe to do so. be that a phone call or in-person encounters, keep all letters, emails, social media posts. It's all essential evidence for a police investigation, or if you decide to apply for an injunction or a restraining order. Yes, it's a lot of work. Yes, it's something else you've got to deal with on top of all of the emotional trauma, but it is important to do it. So you've got all of the evidence for when you need it. And finally, it's just, even if you don't want to report everything to the police. And then the other thing is sort of a lot of police and civilian staff you will deal with during, when you're reporting things to the police, they don't necessarily have any training in stalking. You might be told that what you're reporting is not a crime, because I've had that said to me on several occasions, but you basically have to make the point that yes, this particular incident is not a crime in itself, but it is part of a course of conduct, which is stalking. Because police tend to take every incident in isolation rather than, even though you might be reporting the same person for the 20th time, they're still going to treat whatever you're talking about as on that day as in isolation rather than a course of conduct, which is, I think, where a lot of stalking problems with the police occur. Is it's all little isolated things that they want to try and deal with in isolation. They don't want sort of an overarching thing that's been going on for sort of 2 years and has got 500 incident reports and things like that. Some police forces do have specialist stalking teams, and if yours does, it's always good to try and get through to them, because they're far more likely to be more helpful, more receptive, and can actually help any investigating officers deal with the issue. Unfortunately, I can only think about 3 or 4 forces in England and Wales have specialist stalking teams. And then finally, it's basically, I think, a lot of people think that if they ignore the behaviour, it will stop. Unfortunately, the majority of the time it won't, and it will tend to escalate, because the stalker thinks, oh, well, I did this and I never got reported, so therefore I'm going to try doing this, and if that doesn't get reported, it keeps escalating and escalating. So they get to the point where they feel immune and nothing's ever going to happen to them. So starting early and getting straight in with the police when you start feeling that things aren't right and you are being stalked is really important, because studies have shown that if you report things to the police at the earliest opportunity and the police get involved, then statistically the stalking may well stop. Unfortunately, there's no guarantees that it will, but because some people will just keep going and going and going, even if they end up getting arrested multiple times, taken off, and put in prison, they can still keep going and all that sort of stuff. Because one of the things that I've figured out over the years is that tackling it very early on is going to save you months, if not years, of trauma. The earlier you tackle it, the more likely it is to get dealt with. The more you report, the more likely it is to get dealt with. And I know a lot of people who've gone through something similar, or antisocial behaviour or harassment. They don't want to make a fuss. They don't think they'll be believed, all of this sort of stuff. So they don't do anything, and then they suffer for an awful long time, where they may well have, if they'd stepped in earlier and started sort of trying to take back control and do stuff to try and stop it, through police reports and things like that. That could be helpful. Oh, and the real final thing is never take trying to deal with the stalker into your own hands, because that could end up with you being prosecuted, because they can then turn tables on you and say that you're coming after them, you're the one that's harassing them, rather than the other way, because that's what stalker number 2 did. So basically, police reports, do everything through the legal channels, don't try to find your own retribution or do anything along those lines, because it doesn't work and you can end up in trouble that way, if that makes sense.
All those tips are so vital, and I think a lot of people listen to them can really learn a lot from what you've said. Another thing I'll say is, in the show notes I'll link different support agencies that you can reach out to, or you can learn more on their websites about stalking, and this will include Action Against Stalking. But I mean, What's last to say is, Emily, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. It's been a really eye-opening conversation, and I think a lot of listeners will really take a lot away from it, so thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Research. You can follow my research journey on LinkedIn and X at Karen Fullerton C. Special thanks to all research participants for taking part in my thesis and entrusting me with their story. And thanks to the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science and the University of the West of Scotland.